And the reason is that, it's about legitimacy. The Western powers and the rest of the world, the governments that need to fight terrorism, have to win the war of hearts and minds. And that means maintaining the high moral ground, making sure that your actions promote human rights, democracy, and above all, the rule of law, in the sense of saying, this is how we are different.
Welcome to the award-winning podcast, Lawyer to Lawyer, with J. Craig Williams and Robert Ambrogi, bringing you the latest legal news and observations with the leading experts in the legal profession. You're listening to Legal Talk Network.
Hello, and welcome to Lawyer on the Legal Talk Network. This is Craig Williams coming to you from Southern California. I write a legal blog called May It Please the Court. Bob?
And hello, this is Bob Ambrogi coming to you from Boston, Massachusetts, where I write a blog called Law Sites, and I also practice law.
Well, yeah, I guess I do that too, Bob.
I thought you were retired, Craig.
Oh, no, far from it. Well, before we introduce today's topic, Bob, we'd like to thank our sponsor, Clio, an online practice management software program for lawyers at www.goclio.com.
Well, on November 13th, 2015, a series of coordinated terrorist attacks occurred in Paris, killing and maiming hundreds of people. Ultimately, the terror organization ISIS took responsibility for the attacks in retaliation for French airstrikes on ISIS in Syria and Iraq's soil. These attacks rattled the world and put a spotlight on terrorism once again. So the complete and utter disregard for the rules of war by terror organization, what needs to change? Today on Lawyer to Lawyer, we're going to take a look at how the law plays into terrorism, the recent Paris attacks, terrorism today more broadly in the world versus terrorism yesterday, the Geneva Conventions, and international law's role, what needs to be done legally to stay current in our fight against terrorism.
And Bob, our guest today, is joining us from Arusha, Tanzania. Dr. Lyal Sunga has conducted monitoring, investigation, reporting, technical cooperation, education, and training in some 55 countries over the last 25 years in human rights, humanitarian law, and international criminal law. He is the head of the Rule of Law program at the Hague Institute for Global Justice in the Netherlands and visiting professor at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law in Lund, Sweden. Welcome to Lawyer, Dr. Sunga.
Thank you very much for having me on your show.
Well, can you give us a perspective on the international laws that apply to the situation in Paris, the Geneva Conventions, and the piece that you wrote about how international law can meet the challenges of today's lawless conflicts? Just give us a perspective on what's the framework that we're looking at here.
Well, first of all, the most obvious framework is the domestic criminal law. Obviously, the attacks in Paris constitute a major crime there, but the wider questions that are going to have to be taken into account are how does the international community strengthen its response? Because what we're seeing with ISIS or ISIL or Islamic State or Daesh, whatever you want to call it, is a different kind of phenomenon than we're used to seeing from terrorist organizations. In the past we've seen, in the 1970s and 80s, we've seen terrorist groups pop up here and there, even for some considerable period of time, try to threaten the political independence of the state by waging a terror campaign, trying to intimidate people and the government into changing a particular policy or forcing their agenda, on decision makers. The situation we're seeing now is a game changer in the sense that here you have an organization that is managing to actually hold territory and is not just targeting one particular state, one government within a country, but it is purports to set up a state with territory. That's something we haven't really seen with terrorist groups, which in the past could basically be addressed as if they were criminal, crime syndicates, so organized crime in a way. And to the point I was making in an article I wrote in the Guardian recently, just the day after the Paris attack, is that, like it or not, the response has to be a much more international one than we're used to. Now, that's not something that's not only me that's saying that. I think people obviously recognize that. And that's why we're seeing major powers trying to figure out the best and most effective way to take the fight to so-called Islamic State in what it claims to be its home territory. And rather than to see the situation where you have these people going off, doing their training off in Syria and Iraq, and then returning to Europe or to other countries and launching a fairly sophisticated terrorist attack. So that's why we have to talk much more about international cooperation to fight terrorism and all the regulations and law that could be used to make that fight effective, more so than in the past.
Lyal, this is Bob. That article you mentioned, it was titled, "Can International Law Meet the Challenges of Today's Lawless Conflicts?" And you talk about the Geneva Conventions. You make the point that the Geneva Conventions were adopted in 1949, mainly to limit cruelty in wars fought sort of by regular soldiers. And you raise the question of how those Geneva Conventions can apply to terrorism today, where it's a whole different ballgame, as you've already kind of suggested. But I wonder if you could just, of course, our listeners have all heard of the Geneva Conventions, but remind us what they are about and what they do.
Sure. You know, the first Geneva Convention was adopted in 1864 in Geneva. It's basically all the rules relating to limiting cruelty and trying to regulate the means and methods of warfare. And it's really been sponsored by the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva, Switzerland. And the whole idea of the Geneva Conventions is not to take necessarily a stand on who's right or who's wrong, you know, the fighting parties, but simply to reduce unnecessary suffering, and in doing that, trying to, for example, make sure that hospitals are not subject to attack, to make sure that civilians are not subject to attack, to make sure that when a combatant is captured, that he or she is treated as a prisoner of war, taken care of accordingly, so that at the end of the conflict there could be an exchange of prisoners, just to make sure that sick, wounded, and shipwrecked are taken care of. So the idea is to try to introduce, to the extent possible, humanity in wartime, and to say that the right to inflict damage on the enemy is not unlimited, and also to protect cultural property. So there's a whole bunch of rules out there. For example, it makes no sense for soldiers to use bombs that are made of glass, because you take out the soldier out of action, but glass fragments cannot be detected, so that there's no way you can get the glass fragments out of a person's body, even after the war's ended. So even after the dispute is done and countries are making peace and everybody shake hands, these soldiers and potentially civilians are left maimed for life. So the idea was to humanize war to the extent possible. Now, in the case of the Geneva Conventions, the main ones that are operating in the field right now, were adopted on 12th August 1949. And the presumption there, which was a fair presumption at the time, was that war mainly at the time was an interstate conflict, armed conflict, and you were having a situation of a country's soldiers under responsible command fighting another army. And you could have implementation of the Geneva Conventions and have command responsibility, etc. Now, in the case of the Islamic State, they have command responsibility and they have military discipline and everything else, but it's not the kind that anybody is used to seeing, because first of all, they don't seem to put a high premium on the sanctity of life, and they're deliberately targeting civilians and deliberately violating, the norms that have been developed over, hundreds of years in the humanitarian law field and in the laws of war that one cannot go below. So they're operating on a different basis. I wouldn't make the mistake to say that these terrorists are completely incoherent madmen and psychotic people. They may have all those elements, but they're much more than that. They are following a coherent ideology that is just very much at odds with the minimum civilized norms that we've come to expect. And, with suicide bombings and everything else, it was completely outside the realm of the Geneva Conventions And it makes it very difficult to say to these people, listen, we will respect your side if you respect ours. There's no dialogue there in terms of humanity in warfare. So that's a very big challenge.
What level of cooperation is going to be needed among nations in order to be able to bring forth the things that you're talking about?
Well, I think a high level of cooperation. Right now, we're seeing quite a lot of political will to, share information and intelligence and military operations. But you can sense when you read the news carefully and you talk to people that the cooperation could be much stronger yet. And one of the things I said in the article that was in The Guardian was that one of the gaps in international law, transnational criminal law and international criminal law is there hasn't actually even been a internationally agreed comprehensive definition of the crime of terrorism. Part of the reason for that is that, and there's not a UN convention on terrorism, there's about 19 or 20 conventions addressing particular aspects of terrorism, but we don't have a comprehensive terrorism convention, partly because many states feel that, well, there are some groups we don't want to call terrorist groups. Maybe they're fighting for national liberation, maybe we agree with some of their aims, and we don't want to be implicated committing a crime under international law or be labeled as a terrorist, because some of the use of violence may be legitimate in our view. It's not difficult to define terrorism. We know it when we see it. We know terrorist acts when we see it. But political will to actually nail that down has been lacking, and much more could be done on that score. For example, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court does not have terrorism is covered here and there by some of the crimes of war crimes against humanity, genocide. You could say, well, some of these are in essence cover crimes of terrorism, but there's no crime of terrorism per se set out in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and that's another gap. Now, the United States is not even a party to that, sadly enough, but many countries are, and that's just another gap I could flag that could use attention.
There was a lot of news coverage here in the United States yesterday of the fact that a group called Human Rights Watch is called for the United States government to conduct a criminal probe of CIA torture of terrorism suspects in the past. When we're talking about the Geneva Conventions, how much does the conduct by what we might call the white hats or the good guys here play into this? I mean, some of the way that the United States and other governments have been conducting anti-terrorism operations in recent years have themselves raised questions. So how does that play into this whole equation of enforcing the Geneva Conventions with regard to terrorism?
Well, it is a very important question, and I think many of us internationally were very much appalled by what we consider to be very foolish actions on the part of the George W. Bush government by getting provoked into excesses, so-called enhanced interrogation, and trying to get legal opinions that legitimize what amounts to torture, and trying to say, well, we need to do these things. This plays right into the hands of, it's often been said it's the best recruiting tool for terrorists, because they say, look, the gloves are off, and we welcome the fight. That's what they're saying right now in Syria. They can't wait to see Americans' boots on the ground, and the same thing, with terrorists in Iraq and elsewhere. It's difficult because it means you say, well, why should we abide by the laws of war and the Geneva Conventions if the other side has no intention of doing that? But the thing is that it's not that the terrorists deserve such nice treatment. And in fact, we're not talking about nice treatment. We're talking about the minimum standards of that, you don't torture them, you don't summarily execute them, etc. And the reason is that, it's about legitimacy. The Western powers and the rest of the world, the governments that need to fight terrorism, have to win the war of hearts and minds. And that means maintaining the high moral ground, making sure that your actions promote human rights, democracy, and above all, the rule of law in the sense of saying, this is how we are different. There are thousands of recruits going. They get sucked into the lure of ISIS. But once ISIS gets beaten, they don't have to be beaten by dirty fighting. They have to be eliminated on the ground, fair and square. And that's going to dent their legitimacy, and people are going to start realizing that, it's a losing battle on their side. So legitimacy is really essential, because getting goaded into overreaction just feeds exactly what the Islamic State wants. So it's not just about idealistic notions of human rights or being nice to people, or people are going to be grateful or something like that. No, we're dealing with very hard-headed people that could treat them nice, or you could treat them, nasty. They're going to do the same thing. So that's not the issue. It's that we ourselves have to maintain our legitimate approaches to these issues and not get goaded into excess. I don't know whether I made myself clear on that point.
No, very, very clear. Lyal, we're about midway through the program. We're going to just take a couple of moments break here, and we're going to be right back to continue this discussion, so please stay with us.
Hi, my name is Kate Kenny from Legal Talk Network, and I'm joined by Jack Newton, president of Clio. Jack takes a look at the process of moving to the cloud. Now, how long does it take to move to the cloud, and is it a difficult process?
No, with most cloud computing providers, moving your data into the cloud is something that takes just minutes, not hours or days to do. You can get signed up and running with most services in just a few minutes. And even if you have an existing legacy set of data that you want to migrate to a web-based practice management system like Clio, there's migration tools and migration services that we're able to offer to ease that process. So most firms can be up and running in the cloud in less than 5 minutes and can have their data imported in a matter of hours or days.
We've been talking to Jack Newton, president of Clio. Thank you so much, Jack.
Thank you. And if you'd like to get more information on Clio, feel free to visit www.goclio.com. That's GOCLIO.com.
And welcome back to Lawyer. This is Craig Williams with Bob Ambrogi. And today with us is Dr. Lyal Sunga, head of the Rule of Law program at the Hague Institute for Global Justice in the Netherlands and visiting professor at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law in Lund, Sweden. In our last segment, we've been talking about the tragedy of the Paris attacks, terrorism, the role of international law. Dr. Sunga, what realistically can the world expect in terms of taking this fight to ISIS? Is this a fight that can be won, or is this a fight that, from your perspective and the number of things that you've seen in your life, do we have any chance?
Well, I think we definitely have a chance. I'm optimistic that the fight will be won, because what's at stake is our safety and security at home and abroad. And it's a fight that must be won. But, it's going to take time, and it's going to take a lot of commitment and resolve. But I have no doubt that the recent events, the terrorism is on our doorstep, and, 9/11 tragedy is still fresh in people's minds. It shocked the world over, and so have all the recent tragedies in many parts of the world. I wouldn't underestimate the ingenuity of criminal law enforcement, but it could be tightened up a lot. I mean, coordination could be much stronger, intelligence sharing could be much stronger, and there have to be the safeguards to make sure that people feel safe and not also threatened by government, that government doesn't give the impression that it's overly intrusive or that it intimidates. And I'm not just talking about in the United States or in the Western democracies, but all around the world. Heavy-handedness does nothing for the fight against terrorism or indeed any other kind of fight. So it has to be done carefully, and I think governments are responsible and dedicated enough to carry on that fight. But the key will have to be a strong international and regional cooperation, and there are many avenues through which that has to be done. And I would like to see much more of that.
Lyal, you're urging that states update the Geneva Conventions. What specifically do you think should be in there that's not? How should they be changed to address the kind of the modern realities of war as we live it now?
Well, I want to stress that in terms of the Geneva Conventions, they should be updated, and specifically the Fourth Geneva Convention, which is Article 33, Sub 4, for people interested in international humanitarian law, for example, prohibits collective penalties and all measures of intimidation or of terrorism. But like I say, the Geneva Conventions were drafted in a time when what we were envisaging was soldiers on the field, or potentially freedom fighters who would be wearing their uniforms on the field, and then they would retire at night, this kind of thing that melted into the civilian population. Well, it's rather complex, the Geneva Conventions, because it still distinguishes between non-international armed conflict and international armed conflict, and in many ways, they're very complex. So, the Geneva Conventions should be simplified, should take into account the new kinds of conflict that we're seeing, the kind that is being run by terrorists running around in Syria and Iraq. So I wouldn't be more specific than that at this moment, but it definitely needs to be revisited.
Well, if I could just follow up, maybe this is a naive question, but it strikes me that the Geneva Conventions presume that sort of both sides to the conflict are going to have maybe some regard for the rules of war in some way, or some abide in some way to kind of basic principles of law. And it seems the issue with so many of these terrorist groups is a complete disregard. I think you make this point in your article, a complete disregard for kind of traditional rules of how we go about these things. And how can the Geneva Conventions or any kinds of international laws address that kind of complete disrespect for law?
Yes, well, in fact, you're right that one side is not respecting law, or the law that we are recognizing. They claim to recognize some kind of dictates and decrees and norms that go back to the 7th century, but that's another matter. But you're very much correct to say that, well, this is a very much one-sided in terms of respect for the law. But my point would be that the Geneva Conventions are also important to restrain our own soldiers and commanders, to make sure that in the war that they carry out and the actions that they carry out, that they do follow the rules. And so it's not only to ensure that terrorists are not tortured, but it's also to maintain the legitimate way in which hostilities are conducted in the field. And as I say, that could substantially help, in my opinion, to make sure that in the global struggle, that the legitimacy factor is on the side of law and the rule of law and humanitarian law and human rights. So that may sound very idealistic, but in fact it's not. It's about not going down to the level of the terrorist, because once you go in that direction, in a way you've already lost the war, because then it's just brutality against brutality, and we don't want to go there. We've seen what that looks like, and I don't need to mention some of the major violations that have been committed by the warring parties that normally do follow the Geneva Conventions. But those kinds of things are brandished, those kind of examples, as, oh, look how cruel. And so not only does it help to get recruits, but they say, we in our own way are legitimate because we're just the same as who these people are, who are, attacking us in Syria and Iraq, etc. So in a way, it levels the playing ground in a way we don't want to see. And it has to be, it's going to be a longer fight. It's going to be about respect and human rights and democracy and rule of law, that people are persuaded away from radicalization. And you can't really do that if you throw off the gloves and get down and dirty right away. We've got to win it. We've got to win the struggle, but we have to do it in a way that doesn't feed the struggle on both sides.
Well, we've just about reached the end of our program, and it's time to wrap up with your final thoughts and your contact information. So, Dr. Sunga, if you could just summarize and then give our listeners your contact information should they want to reach out and contact you.
Well, thanks, first of all, for inviting me on the show. It's terrorism is really something that is very clear and present danger, and it's something that's going to take a lot of time effort and resources and cooperation to fight. And so, it's always important to view this whole issue and the measures against it through the legal lens, and not to cast law to the winds, and to realize that we have to take a very responsible and approach to the issue. I thank you very much. I invite people to visit my website, which is www.lyalsunga.com. That's LYALSUNGA.com. And there you'll find, a lot of information on what I do and my publications and what I've done over the last 25 years or so in human rights, humanitarian law, international criminal law for people that are interested. And so thank you again. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you and your listeners.
Thank you so much for joining us all the way from Tanzania today. We really appreciate it. We've been talking with Dr. Lyal Sunga, head of the Rule of Law program at the Hague Institute for Global Justice in the Netherlands and a visiting professor at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law in Sweden. Thank you so much for the time to be with us today.
Thanks again.
And that brings us to the end of our show. I'm Craig Williams. Thanks for listening. Join us next time for another great legal topic. When you want legal, think lawyer to lawyer.
Thanks for listening to Lawyer, produced by the broadcast professionals at Legal Talk Network. Join J. Craig Williams and Robert Ambrogi for their next podcast covering the latest legal topic. Subscribe to the RSS feed on LegalTalkNetwork.com or in iTunes. The views expressed by the participants of this program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by, Legal Talk Network, its officers, directors, employees, agents, representatives, shareholders, and subsidiaries. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer.